Hello, and thank you for joining me. I have another update for my worms in my worm area in the indoor garden. Starting off with my first of my two regular totes. Just as a reminder, if you are new, my totes do not have any holes at the bottom. They are not doubled up where there's another tote bin underneath. It is just one tote, and the top I leave open. I use a mosquito screen over the top to allow it to evaporate some of the moisture that can collect in these types of bins. I find that in my area, with my high humidity in the summer, this works out best for regular totes, especially if you're on a budget using totes. That's the best way that works for me. So this week in this bin, I do have a couple of small worm balls that showed up, and for the most part, the castings are on the wetter side. They're still pretty dry. They're not that muddy texture, but they are still on the wet side. So again, for this week with this tote, I am going to give it a smaller feeding. I feel comfortable doing that because I still have large particles of the cardboard that was shredded that I added a couple weeks ago. And I know I said it the previous week, but definitely for the next week, I am going to be adding some cardboard into this bin to bring the material up because I do want to have a harvest with quite a bit of material whenever I do harvest these. So just a quick update here, nothing much to really discuss about what's going on with this bin. I'm okay with the situation, and then this bin gets set up for the next week. Which brings me to my second of my two regular totes. And I've commented on this before. With my regular totes, I do find it interesting how the two environments are completely different. So even though this one had the bubble wrap over it, it still does have more drier spots than the other bin. I still do have the fan turned towards these, and the fan is on 24 hours a day. It doesn't stop at all. As far as the moisture content and how it's helping, I don't really know if it is just because that it's the summer still, or I should say warmer weather because we're now in September. So I don't know if it's because it's still warm where it seems like it's not really helping much, or if I have to turn it up higher. But there's a good worm ball here too, and the worms are looking nice and healthy. No worm trails along the sides of the bin, so they're not trying to escape from their habitat. They seem pretty healthy. I think in the next week or two, I'm going to do like a check to see if I see any cocoons. I have not been doing that lately. And since I did have that one worm bin collapse, I should take a look at whether I find any cocoons or not. So I am going to keep an eye on that. I gave this one a more regular size feeding than the other one because it wasn't as wet as the other one. And after putting the bubble wrap across this one, really quick update here too, it's set up for the next week. Moving over to my first of my Vermi bag totes. With my Vermi bag totes, these tend to run on the drier side, much drier than the regular totes. So I was a little surprised when this summer the Vermi bag totes were actually more wet than they normally are. This particular tote is one that I harvested shortly after the regular totes. So with this one, I find it to be a bit dry along the edges, which is common and not a big concern. It just means that my concerns for the Vermi bag totes are different than my regular totes, where I want to keep more moisture in these versus wanting to remove it. And I'm just demonstrating how crumbly and dry it is on the edges. But where the food was, it's still pretty moist and the worms are thriving in there. So with this bin, I'm going to give it a more regular size feeding, just like the second regular tote. And I'm going to make sure that when I check this for the next week, the contents are not too dry. Being dry around the edges for these is fine. They're made to dry that way. They're made to release the moisture, but in the interior, I'm fine if it's a little wetter, and I typically will mix the material in to make sure that I don't have or continue to have dry edges around it and make a really harsh environment for the worms. But that is the update for this bin. Nothing major to report with this one. I'm happy with this one too. Moving over to my second of my Vermi bag totes. Now this one is the one that I am basically restarting. I am keeping the amount of food I put in here lower, and I'm focusing on what is happening with the worms themselves. Seeing nice and happy worms in there does make me happy as well too. And the content in here is, again, wetter than what I normally encounter with a Vermi bag tote. And like I said, I think it really has to do with how humid it has been just the last couple of months here in New Jersey. So I am going to give this a smaller feeding than what you see in the regular bins because it's a smaller colony in this one. So I don't want to overfeed it because I don't want a sour bin, and I also don't want to encourage the beetles and the potworms to move in. But again, I don't see any evidence of the worms being agitated and crawling around the sides, so that's a good thing. So I'm going to just give it smaller pieces of a feeding, and of course giving it the grit that the worms need. And then this one will also be set up for the following week going forward. My fifth and final bin is the Vermibag Mini, which is my only flow-through system. And I love these because they do handle quite a bit of food in them. And if you're someone that wants to give your bins a large feeding and then not come back for a week or two, a flow-through system is going to work because you can put a lot into it. And I'm finding with mine, I don't get a lot of leachate or any strong smells when I give it large feedings. At the moment, I am kind of pushing the bounds as to what I can do with the food in the bin. I'm noticing right now I don't see a lot of beetles and I don't see a lot of potworms. So this week, again, because I do deal with the edges of the bin being very dry all the time, and I can't seem to get the bubble wrap to stay. I did get a tip on what to do, but I didn't get this tip before I harvested or did anything with this bin. So I'm still trying to get the bubble wrap under control, but since I hadn't done that for this week, what I'm going to do this week is put some of the watermelon around the edges. Since watermelon has a high water content, as they break it down, it will release the water around the edges and see how that does. And I'm also going to give it a large feeding. I should have anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 worms in this Vermibag Mini. So I'm going to give it a large feeding and see how that, one, affects the beetle population, two, how it affects the edges being crunchy as well, and three, to see if I get anything that drains through the bottom. Again, this is not what I would normally feed them by far. It is much larger, and I know that. And I know I'm risking certain things by doing it this way. But I'd be interested to see how doing this will affect just how the bag reacts. Where if sometimes you do have to put a larger feeding in, will it be capable of handling that? So I'm just going to pull the material from underneath it to cover it. I did forget to shred cardboard, so I don't have any to add to it because I definitely want to add some more because the material level is low on this one. But that will update the feeding on this one for the next week. So we'll see what I find at the bottom of this in a week. And if you've stuck with me till the end, thank you so much. I do appreciate it. If you like the content, please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.